Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madeline Blair, your host of Unlocked. You know, you can't have a successful career without knowing how to deal with the unexpected. Unlocked is here to help you get ready for that, so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options from which to choose. We have an outstanding conversation coming up today, followed by books of impact, books that really make a difference. So do stay tuned. You know, all of us who are working with the public, whether it's marketing or promoting, whatever it is, we eventually find that we have to do a survey in order to understand them. Now, the other day, I was reading my email and there was an invitation to do a survey. Well, I looked at it and I decided, okay, I'll do it. So I clicked on it, I responded. Now, there's a secret to why I did that, because I'm a very busy person. I admit it. And I rarely do surveys unless they're the right ones. Now, when I looked more carefully at who wrote that survey, I said, I know why I was willing to do it. Her name is Jen Clinehens. She's the author of Choice Hacking: How to Use Psychology and Behavioral Science to Create an Experience That Sings. Her professional focus is on how customers want, or I should say, make decisions. And she's about learning what your customers want through surveys. And she'll be talking about some of those secrets. And here she is. So Jen, thank you so much for joining me on Unlocked.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Madeline.
You are so welcome. Well, as I've told you in our prep, we have just so much time, and I know you have so much to share. So I want to give us as much time as possible. You know, everyone talks about surveying people to learn what they're thinking. And I know in my own work that I have to design a survey, and I have to do it very carefully. How did you learn the process and the details for designing surveys?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think when I first started sending surveys out, I literally had no idea what I was doing. So this is before I went to business school, before I went to advertising school and sort of worked in marketing. I actually was in the music business. I was a professional violist and I ran a booking company. And I thought, hey, maybe I should just send a survey out to some people just to see what do they want? You know, how can my booking company help them? And I think that's where the situation a lot of people are in. They kind of know, oh, a survey would be good, but they're not quite sure how to put everything together and what makes a good survey, what makes a not so good survey. So I was kind of asking them any old thing that sort of popped into my head. Would you buy this? Would you like this? You know, and this is years and years ago now. And then obviously in the interim, I went off and got a graduate degree from the VCU Brand Center in advertising, where we practiced and sent and wrote and were guided on how to write better surveys. And then eventually went and got my MBA from Emory, where I also studied, you know, more of a quantitative approach, but those same questions. So what makes a good survey? What makes people even respond to a survey? Because I think that's a really interesting thing that you've, you know, kind of brought up is beyond the survey itself, how do you entice people into actually taking it, which is an art, you know, unto itself. But yeah, I think it was a combination of sort of formal education, but then just experimentation and, you know, working obviously with big brands, but then working with my own business and, you know, for better, for worse, being able to take some more risks with surveying with my own business that I would, you know, with a client's brand or something like that. So yeah, it's just taught me through experience, through formal education, but it's not anything that I think anyone knows how to do instinctually. I think we all need to practice and get better at it.
I think you are so right. We think we can just ask these questions, but that's not the case at all. I can never forget one time I had to do a survey of, I think it was only 1,000 people, but they were people that were employees of my client. So I knew that interaction had to be a really good one. So I kept it to exactly 4 questions because I figured even if the questions were not so great, they knew they only had 4 they had to answer. So for me, that was an important principle. But from your perspective now, what are the most important principles that you should follow as you design a survey?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. So I think the one I try to keep in mind is, there's a different objective for any survey. There's a
Mm,
handful of objectives for surveys. I tend to send them out for my own business, um, to not validate so much, but explore, right? So say to people, like, what are kind of the directions that you would like me to go in, or what are some things that really resonate with you that I might not be doing? Because obviously, with choice hacking as a business, we do a lot of content marketing. We obviously make courses. There is a consulting side to the business, but surveys tend to focus on like digital products because, I mean, that's who that audience is mostly. But I try not to have sort of my own thoughts or assumptions affect my language in the questions that I ask. So you don't want to be like unconsciously thinking, oh, I really want to make this course next, or I really want to write this book next, or I think this person would be a good podcast guest. So I'm going to kind of mold the questions, I mean, consciously or or unconsciously, to favor that person or favor that book,
mm.
or, maybe not ask different questions or questions that might invalidate what you hope to be true. Um, I think I've seen this, in my career in marketing where, somebody will get really enthusiastic about an idea and maybe they send out a survey and you start to notice like, hey, who wrote this question? Because it seems like it's somebody who really wants this idea to be approved by this audience. And you're like, oh no, it's snuck in. So, when I do rate surveys, I tend to also share them with other people just to kind of get that feedback to say, oh, okay, is this really what you meant to say? It kind of feels like you're leaning in this direction because it's so easy to do. So I would say that's the very first principle is like, don't create a survey in a vacuum, and don't create a survey just to validate all the things that you think. Make sure you're trying to invalidate them as well, because you'll be really surprised by what people say.
Oh, I like that, that it's not a question of trying to get your agenda out, but to actually know that it might creep in. So how do you also test the other side? Oh, that's
Yeah.
exciting and
Yeah.
challenging when you write a survey. Good point.
It can be a challenge for sure. Yeah, and I think that's probably the first thing. I mean, the second thing for me, I tend to focus more on the why rather than the what. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that you're not asking them, what type questions, but I've seen a lot of surveys where people will ask people something like I used to when I did surveys before I knew what I was doing, which is, would you buy this product? Would you, be interested in this course? Things like that. And a lot of times, people get into that survey process. It's a lot like being in a focus group. It's a lot like being interviewed by somebody. You kind of don't want to disappoint them, even though they're, out there somewhere. And so you're kind of like, yeah, sure, whatever. I'd be interested in that. That seems okay. But then you get it into the real world and nobody responds to it and you wonder why. Well, it's like, well, you've asked them a very direct question rather than trying to get what are your problems? And then trying to see, okay, does
Mhm.
my solution actually solve those problems? How important is that problem to this person? So trying to get a little bit of like color and flavor around why are you kind of doing what you're doing, even though people may not know themselves. So this is where, you kind of have to take surveys, I think, with a grain of salt, which is knowing how people actually make decisions, how they actually behave. There's all these unconscious influences happening all the time. So the example I always like to give is actually from a focus group, but the principle is the same, which was, back in grad school, I was working with this focus group of moms. And we were talking to them about, and this, we weren't working for the brand at all. This was just a graduate school project to learn how to do focus groups. We were asking them questions about Happy Meal, right? Now, later, I actually did work for McDonald's, but in this case, I was not working for the brand. And we saw these new moms, or relatively new moms with young kids, kind of look around the room and go like, oh no, if I say that the kid was yelling for a Pokemon toy, it's all over because these moms are going to judge me and they're going to think I'm the worst mom. So you could kind of see them
Mm.
like taking some time and calculating and going like, oh, what are they going to think about the story I'm about to tell? Um, so, this is one of the things I think you have to bear in mind is that the space between the raw reaction to your question and what actually may be produced or what they choose or what they are telling you in that space of time, all sorts of things can get in and cloud what that answer might be. So that's why, with surveys, again, always taking it a little bit with a grain of salt. And I think, that is, it's not to say that you can't do concept testing or hypothesis testing in surveys, you absolutely can, right? And a lot of times, especially if you're a smaller business or a startup, that's probably about as good as you're going to get, when it comes to actually validating a hypothesis until you actually go into the market, right? So
Yeah.
you've got to kind of sit there and say, like, would this be something that you're interested in? But I think it's understanding, where are sort of the strengths and weaknesses of surveying, and where do I need to be careful to not like bet the farm on a survey of like 50 people who may or may not be my customer, versus, okay, this is a lot of, good information to have, but we're going to combine it with some other information. Like, it could be, tracking emotions. So face tracking, eye tracking, it could be, salience testing. So how can I maybe combine this with something that's a little less subject to those cognitive biases and sort of those mental shortcuts that people rely on and depend on before they'll, give us an answer, and they may not even be aware that they're doing it at all. So
Jen, I'm going to ask you to just expand a little bit on what you mean by salience testing.
Sorry to your watchers, your listeners. I'm getting over COVID, so I'm trying to keep the vocals, working here. Yeah, so salience testing is something that I use a lot with my clients. I've used with clients in the past. I use a predictive AI tool, which basically can look at a piece of creative or look at a video or look at, even like virtual reality, like 360 recordings of a retail experience. And it can tell you what people are noticing, right? So this is really helpful. You can imagine with things like email or web pages or posters, on the subway. What you find a lot of times is the marketing communications are too cluttered, right? So you're trying to say too many things and people aren't noticing what you want them to notice. People are trying to overcomplicate messages. And what happens to our attention is you've got basically a set amount, so it'll disperse. And it means that you're not paying enough attention to any one thing. I think a good way to think about salience is sort of way back when our brains are developing and everything, and we're, kind of walking through the jungle, right? And we look in the bushes and like there's a leopard hiding in the bushes. Well, our brains had to develop, the tools to be able to say like, oh, okay, I should pay attention to these spots because the spots are different than the blades of grass. And that's kind of where, this principle of salience is like, oh, something is jumping out from its background. So
if I understand you right, part
Yes.
of the job of designing the survey is to determine what the likely saliences would be and then test on those.
No, so what I'm saying is, if you are going to do surveying, also make sure you are combining it with other measures that are like autonomic measures. So measures that are like measuring someone's raw reaction and not necessarily their response to you. So for example, if we're saying concept testing for marketing, we could say, which one do you like better, A or B? But before we've put those two pieces of creative in front of the people in the survey, we also are doing salience testing to say, well, can they even see our brand on here? Like they might like A more than they like B, but if A has a logo that's like this big, you can't notice it at all, then it doesn't work in our favor. It doesn't matter if they like it better. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's like these multiple things coming together to give us the answer rather than just relying on, well, they said they liked A better than B, so let's just put millions of dollars behind A.
Well, oh, interesting. So it could be that you were testing color, but in fact, the user was responding in relationship perhaps to size.
Well, exactly. And I think, or they could say like, oh, this is funny. I like funny ads. I'm going to choose this one. But if it's not doing the actual job that a piece of marketing needs to do, if they, for instance, this happens quite a bit in television advertising where people will really like an ad. Like if you think about something like Geico, I think about the insurance category in general. There's a lot of funny ads, right?
Yeah.
But what will happen is people will watch an entire ad and they'll be like, this is hilarious. I love this. And then someone will ask them, what brand was that for? And they'll go like, it was insurance. Maybe it was like Nationwide, so they'll get the category right, but they won't get the brand right because the brand is not playing as central a role in those key emotional moments as it should to kind of, instill that little memory in our brain. Oh, that was a Geico commercial and not a Nationwide commercial.
As you're saying that, all I can think of are some of the Budweiser advertisements that involved puppies.
Oh,
I
the
think
puppies.
I'll
Yes.
never forget the puppy one.
Mhm.
So
You know
you're right.
what's really interesting about that? Yeah, that puppy, the puppy and the horse. If anybody
Yes.
hasn't
Yeah,
seen these,
yeah.
like get some tissues and go watch them on YouTube. They're very sweet. However, even the CEO of Budweiser said people love those ads, but they don't sell any beer. And the reason they don't sell any beer is because the brand wasn't playing an integral part. Now, I would say the agency would argue, oh, well, the Clydesdales, that's a
Yeah.
brand asset.
Yeah.
People know what that is. But I think those ads may have proved that maybe that tie between the Clydesdales and Budweiser maybe isn't as strong as it once was, as they weren't kind of making that connection between the two things.
Well, it's interesting because as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, listen, I remembered it's Budweiser because of the Clydesdales, but
Well, yeah.
I don't drink beer. I just like
Okay.
puppies. And so
Yeah.
I was responding to the puppies.
Yeah. Sales of puppies went up. Sales of beer remained flat.
Oh gosh, this is complex, isn't it?
I mean, it's like anything. It appears simple on the surface, and then once you start to scratch around and dig, you're like, oh my gosh, this can be a little bit more complicated.
Mhm.
I think one of the other things to mention, I think about surveys as well, and this idea of like raw reactions, and the faster you can get a response is the better. There actually is like a sweet spot for survey responses. So if we're taking the example of ad A versus ad B, right? Which one of these do you like better? There is a sweet spot between about 600 milliseconds and 2.5 seconds where people are going to give you their response without all of that thinking too much, without all of those sort of cognitive biases and things sneaking in. I mean, that's what the research says between, sometime there. At Choice Hacking, we have sort of our own secret sauce of where we feel like within that window, we're getting the right responses. We won't share that because that's proprietary, but it is within that, bigger kind of research window of 600 milliseconds and 2.5 seconds. But if you can get a survey in front of someone who's, you're doing something like that, you're concept testing, and you're conscious of how much time you're allowing for the response, or you're recording the amount of time that they're taking for a response, you can start to determine, okay, well, the responses that we got were overwhelmingly positive, but it took people 5 seconds to decide. Now, do we feel like not just is it the right number of people, is the right type of people who are reflective of our customer base answering the survey? It's, well, did they take too long, or did they do it too fast? They're not paying attention. They're just clicking like A, because I don't know, they want the $50 gift card or whatever they're going to get at the end.
Yeah.
So it becomes really important to start to think about things like timing and say like, okay, well, if we're doing some kind of like hypothesis or concept testing, how long are we really allowing people to kind of sit there and make a decision?
Interesting. I was recently surveyed, and I demanded more time because the questions that they asked were really significant questions. Like if somebody asks me, what are your values? I really want to think about it before I respond. So
Yeah.
I can see that you have to be thoughtful about the kinds of questions that you ask as well. If you're going to use that response rate. Although I love the fact that there is a sweet spot that says this is a person who is really responding. I'll call it intuitively. That may not be the right word, but maybe honestly would be better. How would you describe that?
Well, it's hard to describe. I mean, I would maybe say intuitively. I mean, we use the phrase raw reaction. So the raw reaction being before you kind of get, the other things, clouding the whole decision-making process. But, and again, I mean, those numbers are from research for things like visual testing or, like testing like a TVC, so television commercial, things like that. With actual questions, I mean, there's probably a little bit more room for leeway because you have to also then allow for people who might be slower readers or who need to read the question a couple of times to really understand the meaning. So it becomes a little less like, this is the amount of time you give them when it's like reading a question. But I think you could use the word intuitively, sure. But yeah, it's just as long as you're kind of getting the concept, like if they think too hard, you're going to kind of move further and further away from how they might actually respond to something.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. I also find it rather irritating when we talked about that you needed to get your agenda out of the way, not completely, but You had to at least test both sides. And I'm thinking about the many surveys that I get from political organizations where I see, is it this or is it that? And I'm thinking, neither. It's somewhere in between. Well, tell me some thoughts about this. Why do organizations, especially political ones, tend to design it that way? So there's really no satisfactory response. It's clear they have an agenda.
Well, I mean, it's exactly for that. It's because they have, some purpose, some objective, which may not be the greatest or most ethical purpose or objective. Probably, it's some combination of wanting to make a headline. So imagine if you ask a question in a survey that says, the president, whoever the president might be, is he a great president or is he the best president ever? And certain people have been caught doing surveys like this. We won't go down a political path, but use your imagination. And then it's like, well, and then they'll run a headline that says 85% of people say this president was a great president. And you're like, no, that can't be true. How is that true? Well, it's because they asked them, is he the best president ever or a great president? And you're like, well, it's not the best one ever. So I guess I'm going to choose, great. I mean, that's an extreme example, but you can see why. I mean, I think a lot of times you get these organizations, might be political, it could be, fill in the blank, like media, whoever, who they want the clicks, they want a sensational headline. Yeah. They want something, I think also, that kind of pulls on this idea of social norming. So if you're familiar, we talked quickly about it. So this idea that, that our social context plays into a lot of what we deem as like acceptable behavior, quote unquote, normal behavior. And when we start to see stats like 99% of people, drink Coca-Cola once a month. Like it's not true, but I just use it as a point of example. If you saw that and you did not drink at least one Coca-Cola every month, you might start to think, well, first of all, it's permissible to do that. I'm sitting here drinking a Coke Zero, but if I drank a regular Coke, I would feel like I was, I don't know, doing drugs or something. It's just like too much for me. I can't do it. But if I heard that 99% of the population was drinking a regular Coke once a month, I'd be like, oh, well, I'm weird. I guess it's okay. Maybe if I just have one, it's enough, just as an extreme example. But this idea that, if you hear that most people are doing something that you're not doing, so 75% of people, use one set of towels when they visit a hotel. Well, I don't do that. So I must be like the weird, person. So maybe next time I go to a hotel, I should do what everybody else does, because obviously it's unacceptable, the behavior that I have to just throw the towels on the floor every time I use them and get a new set of towels, as an example. But yeah, this idea of social norming, if you can then use sort of an unethical survey structure, questions, to create things like headlines, then all of a sudden everybody looks around and they go like, oh, well, most 75% of people think, this politician is a great politician. So maybe it's acceptable for me to like voice my support for this person or their policies. It's like the whole idea of, the more acceptable something seems to be, the more people sort of, come out of the woodwork to support it, in either direction, right? Like the more normal something seems, the more obvious it is for people to kind of say like, I believe that too.
Is that part of the psychology of marketing?
Oh gosh, I don't know if you want to lump marketing in with political surveys. I mean, marketing's not all, ethical roses, I guess. But I think it is an unethical type of marketing, and that certainly exists. I mean, there's certainly brands and companies out there that do unethical things, whether it's designing platforms or digital experiences with deceptive patterns, for example. Those are also called dark patterns, but deceptive patterns where, for example, they make it really, really easy to sign up for something, but then they make it almost impossible to cancel.
Oh, yes.
Or you could argue, with like Threads that just came out. So you had an Instagram account, you open a Threads account, but now if you want to close your Threads account, you have to close your Instagram account too. So you could say, oh, that's a deceptive pattern, right?
Yes.
So they're not uncommon. They certainly exist. I think part of the job of marketers, and those marketers who take their job seriously and the ethics of their job seriously, which, to be frank, not everyone does. I mean, we've all been on Twitter and seen those threads about, doing things, and you're like, wait, that's unethical marketing. Why are you telling people to do this? But people haven't kind of taken the moment or taken a minute to just say, hey, should I be doing this? Is this manipulating the end user? Is this manipulating, for example, your example, survey responses for my own personal gain or a broader agenda, which is not, for the benefit of the person taking the survey or the person reading the results.
What this calls to mind is one of the recommendations that I make to people when they want to build their resilience and nurture it. And I say, to begin, you've got to know who you are. And the better you know who you are, the more confident you become. And I can see that feeding a better let me say that differently. I can see that supporting a person being more independent as they respond to a survey, rather than, as you're suggesting, that you just sort of say, well, if everybody does it, then it's okay. In other words, you have a sense of who you are. Is that consistent with your thinking?
I mean, here's what I'll say is, psychology and behavioral science principles, not every single one of them works on 100% of people. So if you tell everybody that, 99% of people drink a regular Coca-Cola every month, a lot of people would look at that and say, but I don't, and be very proud of the fact that they don't. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that would steer their behavior in the other direction. Now, what would tend to happen with most people is they would go, oh, okay, well, that's kind of a normal behavior. That's something I should be doing. Okay, I'll just kind of go with the flow. But I do think, when you have a strong set of principles combined with the fact that you're thinking deeply about how you're responding to things, you're taking the time. And, like we talked about, the difference between a raw reaction and kind of putting, answers through, in this case, a set of personal values. Do I feel like my answer is reflective of my personal values? That would be taking the time to do that. And that's, I think, the usefulness of a set of values is being able to say, like, okay, let's filter my personal instinct through, like critical thinking and gathering evidence and kind of going through that whole process, rather than just saying, like, oh yeah, of course. I mean, you have to just kind of like take a beat and do that. So I think, you make good points about, like the ethical side of marketing. I think you make good points about having like a personal set of values to kind of influence how you think through that process and the answers that you ultimately give. But yeah, I mean, it really comes down to the difference between those two things, the raw reaction and, the sort of more measured, thoughtful response.
I want to go back to surveys a bit, because oftentimes when I do surveys, I always include an open-ended question. Now, a lot of my researcher friends say, oh my goodness, but that's so hard to analyze. And I said, yeah, but that's where the meat is. Do you ever use open-ended questions? And when do you choose to do that?
I do use open-ended questions occasionally. It depends on the sort of way I'm approaching a project. So for example, I am doing some combination of user interviews or customer interviews and a survey, I don't necessarily need those two things to kind of overlap. So the interviews would typically include more open-ended questions, just because, it's more of a discussion. I can pull kind of things out of them. I can say, oh, that's interesting. Can you talk more about that? Whereas I have, obviously different limitations in a survey where it's like, they're just going to type in whatever they want to type in. And sometimes they'll type in like, no, yes, I don't think so. And they're not kind of giving you more information. Occasionally you get people who give terrific answers. They'll sit down and, write a couple of paragraphs, and that's obviously really useful. So I guess the short answer is it depends. It depends on the objective of the survey. I certainly think you can do it, but I agree with your researcher friends. The more of these open-ended questions that you have, you start to get, the fun little pie diagram that has like 50,000 little things because everybody gave you a different answer. That's never fun. And then obviously you've got to dump all that into an Excel sheet, and you've got to code things and, do all of that. But I certainly think it's something that you can do if you're just, prepared for having to then go through and digest and say, oh, they use these words, but that's a lot like these other words that somebody used. So I'm going to say that, it's kind of a similar response. Yeah, it's just really down to personal preference, timing, budget, and like the size of the project.
Yeah. I've been known to process about 6,000 of them for a particular project that was really important. And yes, it took a lot of time. Yeah. And
I bet it did.
The results were fantastic. I mean, the client was doing cartwheels because we really got to the issues. But, as I'm thinking about it, today, I would throw that into AI. Well, do you think that could change the way in which people think about surveys? If AI really could go through thousands of responses and sift it out? Have you tried that?
Yeah. I mean, potentially. I haven't tried it yet. I've tried it with some like dummy data sets and things because I'll be honest, at this point, I'm not confident about putting
Mm.
client data into
Mhm.
any AI engine. And that just might
Yeah.
be the old like Fortune 10 DNA that I've got from working at, a big, very secure company for a long time. My first thought is there a risk that somebody else could see this? So I think for me, for clients, not right now, but with dummy data and things, just kind of go back and check and see like, oh, did I agree with it? I mean, I think it can certainly, we'll see where it goes over the next couple of years, but there's definitely some big potential there. For those like language learning models and things to kind of go through and say like, oh yeah, well, this is similar to that. And they start to group things and, maybe pull some insights and things, but I think we'll see kind of where this all goes. Hypothetically, yes. In principle, I agree, but we'll see.
I love it. That's such a British term, in principle.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are the benefits of doing surveys? I think you've hinted at many of them, but what are the benefits?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it depends on the type of survey you want to run and sort of the purposes. I mean, for me, I think it's always been really helpful with clients for things like hypothesis testing, concept testing. So now we're talking like, marketing creative, things like that, to really understand like, what are people responding to? Is this, kind of resonating with, I say quote unquote normal people, but like non-advertising people, non-marketing people, because as an industry,
Give
we
me
have a real tendency to kind of be insular.
give me
Oh,
an
sorry, go ahead.
example. Give me an example of a hypothesis that would be tested. I mean, a really
I
specific one.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the easiest one would be something like headline testing. So I have headline A and headline B. Which one of these, would you respond to? Or which one of these do you like best? That kind of thing. So a headline, could be like, buy our new burger. Or a headline could be like, I mean, that now I'm confusing it with behavioral science, but let's just keep going with it. All right. So like buy this new burger or, get 50% off your second burger for free or something. So it's concept testing that way, headline testing. I've confused everything with behavioral science, but that is another way you can use it. You can say like, hey, why don't we frame this as like, don't miss out on 50% off or get two for the price of one. Now has a lot of behavioral science like implications in terms of how you're using loss aversion and how you're talking about numbers and things. But it's also just on its face could just be like headline testing. Just which headline makes you want to buy a burger more?
Let me turn the question a different way. Let's say that I won't say that I'm the CEO of a company. I will say that I am the marketing manager. How do I prepare myself to bring in someone like yourself to say, I want the survey? What are the things they need to think about in relationship to engaging with you?
To come in and do a survey. I mean, most of the clients that I'm working with that are bringing me in to do surveys, are what you're describing. So they're a marketing manager, they're a marketing director, or they're like a hands-on founder. And usually they'll come to you under the guise of, I need to know more about my users. I need to know more about my customers. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times it's just that flat on the face. Because if it's something like concept testing, that's fair enough. I mean, they understand how to do that. It's A/B testing, right? It's not super complicated beyond building the survey and, getting all the pieces of creative and then
Let's tell
finding the
the
people to
audience that
take
an
it.
A/B test is what you described earlier.
Yeah.
You
So it's
test
just
out this
like
option versus
headline
this
A,
option. Yeah.
headline B. Just pick A or B. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think, beyond that kind of stuff, which they tend to do, unless they just don't have the manpower to do it, it tends to be something like, we're thinking about this new product, or we're not sure where a product roadmap should go, or we're really not sure what our users or customers care about, or this first product was really successful, but we have no idea where to go from here. And usually, it is some combination then of survey, of user interviews, of focus groups, of like we talked about, could be salience analysis, or sort of pick from the menu of the different tools that you have in your tool belt to answer this question. We need a new product, or we need to know more about our users, or what our users want. But it always really has to start with the question, because without the question, without some objective of saying, we want more of a steer around what our users want and are they happy with what we're giving them, that kind of thing, you won't have a successful like user research project, because you need the objective to kind of like find the answer.
Okay. So I better be clear about what I think I want to accomplish.
Yeah, and I would say like any consultant that you work with who's a good consultant will also work with you on refining the question, right?
Yeah.
They'll help
Yeah.
you like understand, okay, yeah, that's a good starting place, but let's dig a little bit deeper. What is the question we really want to answer? And that obviously the consulting profession would not exist if that wasn't the case. But yeah, I think having just kind of a general steer on what is our broad objective for this, you know, and it could just be something as simple as we need to get to know our users better, and then you can work with the consultancy or the agency or the consultant themselves to say, you know, we want to dial down on this a little bit more, can you help us figure out what questions to ask, and if this is the right question to be asking of the survey itself, just full stop.
Got it. All right, now I want to shift the perspective. I'm now a reader. I'm reading the newspaper and I'm reading results of surveys. What should I be thinking about in order to assess whether this is a good piece of information or whether I need to question?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing to ask yourself is, how sensationalist is this headline? How attention grabbing is this headline? Does this headline sound too supportive of one direction or the other? I mean, I think it's difficult because a lot of times when they're sharing survey results in something like the newspaper or, you know, online, you don't necessarily get to see all the questions that they asked or the selections that people had. Like sometimes you do, and you should. So if that's the case, I would say, yeah, like go see what the whole question was. Go see, you know, what were the actual options that they gave people. How many people responded is a really big one, because you'll see these, you know, big sensationalist headlines and they'll say like 50 people in the state of West Virginia responded to the, you know, and it's like, well, that's not representative of the entire country. That's not even representative of like a region of the country. That's not enough people, right? I mean, 50 people, it's not going to representative of, you know, like the whole thing, right? So I would say at least look for 1,000 people. At the very least. And I see this a lot in the marketing industry as well. You'll get these sensationalist headlines like, you know, I don't know, CMOs say that AI is going to replace every advertising agency. And then you see, we talked to 5 CMOs. It's like, well, great. You talked to 5 people. That's not a survey. But yeah, just being careful of like how many people, who they asked, and what the options were.
Great. So numbers, how they asked, and what the options were.
And who they asked as well.
That. And what was the last one?
Who they asked. So was it a representative population? If this happens a lot in political surveys as well, they'll say, we talked to 1,000 Republicans in the state of Alabama, and we asked them how much or how many of them would vote for, you know, Trump to run again. Well, I mean, look at the selection. Yeah. It's a deep South state with people that identify as Republicans. Or, I mean, you could say it vice versa as well. Would you vote for Joe Biden? They asked 1,000, you know, Democrats in the state of Vermont or whatever. You got to like consider the source a little bit.
Got it. Oh my. I think this was a really valuable discussion, Jen, because so much of what we read in the newspapers is particularly in the political realm, are a reflection of these surveys. And so I just want to thank you so much for laying it out and giving us a much better idea, at least me, a much better idea of what's really involved and how to read them and how to prepare for them. So thank you. And I wonder, do you have any closing comments for our viewers?
Sure. I would just say, you know, if some of the things I've been talking about have been interesting to folks, like they can visit choicehacking.com. There's what feels like 1 million blog posts I've written about how people make decisions, how we take in information, you know, how we evaluate sort of our context and how our context influences the decisions that we make. And then also how, you know, we might think that we're making decisions because of one thing, but we're actually making decisions because of some other unrelated factor we haven't even considered. So I think the more we can all learn about how, you know, our brains work and how we tend to make decisions, it's always going to be, you know, good, not only for marketers, but for anybody, just for us, you know, evaluating our own sort of, you know, opinions, values, feelings, and behaviors. So it's choicehacking.com. You know, I have courses at choicehacking.academy. I have a podcast called Choice Hacking. And as you showed, I have a book called Choice Hacking. So now we know that I am very uncreative when it comes to naming things. I found one name that people seem to resonate with, and I was like, I'm not changing it for anything. So if you look it up on YouTube.
I do the same thing with Unlocked.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, listen, if it's not broke, don't fix it.
That's right.
That's what we'll leave you with. How about that?
Jen Clinehens, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Marilyn.
You are so welcome. Okay. Well, now it's time for the report on the book. And I brought one that somewhat relates to what we've been talking about with Jen. Not about surveys, but about how you then convey what you've learned. And I did this as a pre-recording. So let's see what I had to say. If you haven't met or heard Sam Horn talk about anything, you've missed someone who is the best. About 8 years ago, I was on a panel with 3 other people. That panel was moderated by Sam Horn. In preparation for that, Sam sent us 4 questions. She said, be ready to answer these 4 questions and be ready to answer these 4 questions in 2 minutes and nothing more. Clear? Now, I like to work with moderators, and so I scripted my responses. I rehearsed them, and I was ready. So on the day of the panel itself, we met with Sam just before we went on stage, and she said, these are the 4 questions I'm going to ask you. Be ready. 2 minutes. That's what you've got. We went on stage, and she began, and she ran them and moderated the panel exactly as she had said she was going to. She moved across the panel, question by question, and fortunately, I think everybody believed her, and so they prepared their responses in the 2-minute slot. Now, the man who sat next to me, he was fantastic, by the way. At one point, he said, I feel like I'm following the Beatles. Now, don't worry. I mean, he was the one who always came after me. Don't worry. I was not that good. But I don't think I had ever performed and come off better than that day from that rehearsing and scripting and being ready and focused on what I had to do. Thanks to Sam's preparation. I hope I've done it since then, but that day was a first for me. And as I said, the guy next to me really was fantastic. That experience reinforced in me that Sam Horn knows what she's talking about. In 2015, just 8 years ago, Sam published her book, Got Your Attention: How to Create, Intrigue, and Connect with Anyone. Yes, I got the book immediately. You don't argue with success. It opens with what she calls the W5 form. She asks you 5 questions, but those 5 questions have to be in relationship to something that you want to promote or talk about or something. Well, I picked something in my mind, and I used that as my example. It was really good because it made the learning from the book more specific, because I had an action. I could turn her ideas through action into what I was trying to accomplish anyway. It began with talking about your introduction. She said you have to grab their attention, and she offered a couple of strategies. One of those strategies was to begin with questions like, did you know? So I thought about my situation and my project, and I said, well, did you know that a great book, any great book, has a single clear message? Did you know that Warren Buffett reads 4 hours a day? And did you know that professionals don't have 4 minutes to read, let alone 4 hours to read? And yet they need to constantly be learning. Her second recommendation is that you then turn that into imagination. So imagine if you received something every week that gave you news insights in less than a minute. Wow, that would be cool. Imagine if you could always go back and review the earlier ones, just in case you missed something, you were on vacation or something. What if you could have something that delivers 30 seconds of insights from experts? Felt pretty good to me. Chapter 2, she introduces what she calls the 7 P's of disruption. The first one is purpose. You got to be clear about your goal. And for me, it was to help leaders. When I thought about my product, my new product, I want to help leaders be more effective. Number 2, you have to think about the person. Okay, I said, it's the leaders. That's who I want to target. The problem, the third was problem. What frustrations or challenges does the target audience have? Well, it has to do with the fact that you need to be learning all the time, but it's really hard to find that time. The premise. Why are you doing this? Why does it have to be that particular way? What is there about the new way, the better way? Well, I know that learning is incremental, and so it needs to be a small piece that's given to you regularly. The product. The 5th is product. This is where the brainstorming gets new. What is it that you're going to do to take all these ideas and turn it into something that's deliverable? Well, for me, it had to be something that could have no reading and no searching. Promise was the 6th one. You have to make sure that when people read or receive your product, they know they can trust it. And so I said, in my case, whatever I publish, it's going to be from experts. And the 7th was pop. So that's what Sam calls it, pop. You have to give your new product an intriguing name that will opt it out of its pack. And so I decided to call mine Mental Espresso. She offers many other suggestions throughout her book. She talks about being time efficient. You have to stay that short period of time so that people don't get distracted, if nothing else. The second is that you have to interact with them. Don't just inform them. Make something memorable. And so I thought mental espresso was pretty cool. The shot can stimulate it's the shot that can stimulate your business. I thought that was pretty cool. Got to wake up your work. The 5th was to give. You have to give attention first. So I decided that whatever this product is, this mental espresso is, there's not going to be ifs, ands, or buts. It's going to be, this is what the experts say, plain and simple. 6th, it has to be useful. That means I've got to curate those little clips, those little bits. And the 7th, she says, you need examples. And it has to be a real example. It can't be some phony story that you make up. It's got to be real with specifics. It's a good book. I've only given you the tippy tip of it. But let's look at what happened. Going back to my product that I talked about, put it all together. This is what I came up with. Did you know that in a great book, there is a single message? Clear message. Did you know that Warren Buffett reads 4 hours a day? And did you know that professionals rarely have 4 minutes a day to read, let alone 4 hours? And yet they need to be learning all the time. Imagine if you could get each week a new insight in 30 seconds. Imagine if you could always review the former messages at any time. An aromatic cup of mental espresso delivers 30-second videos of insights from experts. Let's see one.
What is it that I offer? And that's the point of one's calling. My favorite definition of calling is that it's the intersection of our greatest gifts and the world's greatest needs.
Mental espresso is the shot that can wake up your work. And if you really are interested, go to my website, madelineblair.com/mental-espresso, and sign up. That's Got Your Attention by Sam Horn. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. If you're curious about the background of the show, check out my book, Unlocked. I do have my book here. There it is. There it is. I know you've all seen it, but there it is again, since I've been showing so many books today. And if you'd like to explore what it means to work on your resilience with me as a mentor, just send me an email. I will get back to you. Let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to tell you? No, I think, well, except to say that my email is madeline@madelineblair.com. That's on the screen. So what did you learn today? Make a comment on social media. Not just what you learned, but what you're going to do differently as a result. And if you're on YouTube, click the like button. Better yet, subscribe. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.